Good evening. Welcome to the Mob Museum. My name is Jeff Schumacher, and I'm so happy to see what we call a full house here. It's awesome. Thank you. For those keeping score, this is the second program we have done since our reopening. For the first one last month, I spoke to those assembled here in the courtroom from a remote location. Tonight, our speaker is here in the flesh, although, of course, keeping his distance. Tonight's program has it all, I think. First, we have a wise and entertaining speaker in Michael Green. Second, he will be speaking on an endlessly fascinating topic, the Kennedys. Love them or hate them, we can't stop talking about them, right? And third, his talk will have a distinctly Las Vegas flavor to it. In my experience, this is a recipe for a great program. For those who are not familiar with Mike, a short biography is in order. Michael grew up in Las Vegas, earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in history from UNLV, and his PhD in history from Columbia University in New York. He returned to Las Vegas and taught for 19 years at the community college, most recently called the College of Southern Nevada. It's probably had 3 names during your tenure.
At least.
6
we were
years
from our creditors.
6 years ago, he became an associate professor of history at UNLV. He is a member of the board of directors of this museum and director of Preserve Nevada. Mike is the author of many articles and books about Las Vegas and Nevada, as well as several books about the Civil War. After the program, if you have questions about that particular war, I ask you to please save them for another time. We're going to talk about organized crime in Las Vegas tonight. So yes, we will take some questions after Mike's presentation. We have a microphone set up, and we'll ask that you come up one at a time and ask your questions at the mic. And we're going to clean the microphone in between each person, so we'll make sure that that's not an issue. Okay, so let's get started. Please welcome Michael Green.
Thank you. It's good to be here. These days, it's good to be anywhere. Thank you. Jeff had told me about this contraption, which I guess Jonathan Ullman has been using for various talks, and the joke is they call it the Pope-mobile. And it's kind of appropriate because Harry Truman was asked in 1960 if he was worried that John Kennedy was Catholic, that would hurt his chances of winning. And Truman's response was, "I'm not worried about the Pope, I'm worried about the Pop." We'll get into the Pop later. However, I have been looking at this and thinking that at some point I need to do Spock and Kirk in Star Trek. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or something. But I'm going to take this off since I'm back here and let you see me, heaven help you. And we're going to talk about the Kennedys and organized crime. And Jeff's right. I mean, this story has sex, it has violence, it has money, it has mystery. You can't go wrong. So we're going to go ahead. The connections are many, varied, and strange, and to say it's untangling a web only begins to address it. There's a lot that we cannot figure out, some of which we'll discuss tonight. Some of it is fairly obvious to us all, and some of it is less obvious than we think. The question's worth asking because for many years there have been the rumors that Joe Kennedy was connected to organized crime, having been involved in liquor at some point. Now, was he? Well, I list a few reasons they think he wasn't. Now, it is not, I would say, politically correct or necessarily appealing to quote Woody Allen these days, but he once said organized crime saves a lot of money on office supplies. They didn't write things down, and historians who have studied this often have the tendency to say, well, we haven't found anything in the Kennedy papers showing that he was connected to the mob, therefore we don't think Joe was connected to the mob. And you really don't expect Joe Kennedy to write a letter to somebody saying, you know, I'm connected to the mob. So it's a little hard to tell. We do know that, yes, his bank was involved in whiskey. Yes, he was involved in distilleries after Prohibition. That we know. Now, was organized crime involved in distilleries after Prohibition? What do you think? He also was involved in Hollywood, and it's worth remembering that Bugsy Siegel goes to Hollywood to pretty much take over the unions. But that's in the late 30s, and Joe Kennedy's involved in the 20s. That's also when he begins a long-term affair with Gloria Swanson, which begins a trend for Kennedy men and Hollywood stars. We then have Marilyn. JFK Jr. dated Daryl Hannah. I don't know where we're going next. I always think of the rumor about Bobby and Marilyn Monroe and what my late mother said. She said he had 11 children. Where do you think he had the time? I bet he found the time. So, was Joe connected to those characters on the right? He probably encountered them. We just don't know for sure. We do know that JFK got involved with organized crime people in some way, shape, or form. Exactly how? Again, it depends on how you view it. JFK came here in 1960 to see the guys on the left. Now, Dave Schwartz of UNLV next month is going to talk about the Sands, and I don't want to tread on his toenails. But the story is basically in 1960, the Sands hosted the Rat Pack when they were here to film Ocean's 11. Now, the Rat Pack originates in Southern California. The rumor is that Lauren Bacall named them when they were at the Bogart Bacall estate in Holmby Hills. They were recovering from an evening of, shall we say, bad behavior. And she said, "You're nothing but a Holmby Hills Rat Pack." And the name stuck. And Frank kept trying to change the name, and it just didn't work. Now, the ties here in 1960 were that when Ocean's 11 was being filmed for 5 weeks in the early part of the year, they performed at the Sands, and various people came out here to see them perform. And there are photos of Lucille Ball standing up and being greeted, and Jack Benny. Bob Hope came and apparently went on stage with them, and after an hour, they threw him off the stage, which sounds a bit like Bob Hope. You couldn't keep him off the stage with a bazooka. Well, John Kennedy came out here as well. Now, when Kennedy came out for the Rat Pack, he had one obvious connection, and that is the fellow second from right in the photo, Peter Lawford, who was married to Patricia Kennedy, JFK's sister, which is why Frank Sinatra liked to refer to Peter Lawford as the brother in Lawford. Well, he was connected to the family. Now, as for Sinatra, there were some possible connections we're going to explore, but while he was here, Kennedy got some money for his campaign. He made some friends, who we'll talk about shortly, and his friendship with Sinatra led to Frank and Dean recording a campaign song for him, and then Frank being the MC and organizing the entertainment for the inaugural ball when Kennedy was inaugurated. Y'all doing okay? Those of you watching the live stream, I wonder if my reflection is bouncing all over the place from this. Well, it may have been the Jack Pack, if you think about it. They were friendly, and they also kind of resembled each other in a way. And I'll go back and forth for a second, but we're talking here about the epitome of cool. That's how these guys seemed at the time. Today we look back and look at some of the humor and go, ugh. And we say, you know, there was a lot of smoking, a lot of drinking, all the things we should not do. But that isn't how it seemed at the time. And if you think about John Kennedy, yeah, he was the cool politician. He was the guy who looked well-dressed and good-looking and all of those things. He fit in well with the image of the Rat Pack. So for it to be the Jack Pack, as they sometimes were called, kind of made sense too. Now we'll try to tie this back to the Rat Pack shortly, but there's an old saying. In a lot of cities, they get upset with their mayor now and then. But in Chicago, they would get upset with their mayor daily. Thank you, I'm here all week. Richard Daley won his first election in 1936, and he pretty much controlled Cook County Democratic politics until 1976. And he often said, "Syndicate? What crime syndicate? We don't have those in Chicago." Well, the gents down here, Tony Accardo and Sam Giancana, might disagree with that. There were reports that they influenced Daley. There were reports that they used to complain all the time that Daley didn't pay attention to them. So who controlled whom? We see a bit of that in Nevada with discussions of Pat McCarran, where a lot of people think of McCarran as the senator in Godfather Part 2 and under the control of the mob, and there is a lot of evidence to suggest McCarran controlled them pretty well when he was here. Well, the story is that on election night in 1960, Daley told JFK, with a little bit of luck and the help of a few close friends, "You're going to carry Illinois." So did Daley and the mob elect JFK? Well, if the mob was involved, they probably would have done a better job. Seriously. JFK won as many votes in the Chicago area as Ike did in '56, and he presumably would have done quite well in an area that was heavily Democratic, Catholic, and with a significant black population. If he had lost Illinois, he still had enough electoral votes to defeat Richard Nixon. None of this means that Daley and the mob didn't pull any shenanigans, but they certainly didn't make his victory possible by stealing Illinois for him. Did the mob possibly help in other places? We don't know for sure. We do know that there were some mob-connected businessmen who contributed to him, and some entertainers whom they encouraged to support him. Did that mean votes? It may have. Might have even cost him a few votes. Then there's the triangle, or the quadrangle, or, well, at any rate, it's the web and it's tangled. And there are angles. So let's try to pick this apart. When Jack Kennedy visited Las Vegas, he also met a woman named Judith Campbell. Judith Campbell had an affair with JFK and vice versa. Now, it is kind of hard to figure out how JFK had time to do anything else when you consider all the stories about him and women. But she brought the receipts, you might say. She had phone records, and she reported seeing him during the campaign and then at the White House. Sinatra also introduced her to Sam Giancana from the Chicago mob. Frank was alleged to be the front man for Giancana's interests, the Calneva Lodge at Lake Tahoe and a piece of the Sands. Those were the allegations. She and Giancana had an affair. Now, in 1975, there was a Senate committee led by Frank Church of Idaho that investigated assassinations. She denied, in testifying, any links between JFK and Giancana, or that she had anything to do with that, but she later claimed Kennedy knew about it, and she was a go-between for them. Now, she said she lied to the Senate about that because she feared for her life. And truthfully, if I had to choose who I fear more, the U.S. Senate or the mob, not a tough call. However, there may have been good reason for her to be fearful. That was Johnny Rosselli. Now, Johnny Rosselli was another mobster she was friendly with. Whether they had an affair, we don't know. He was reputedly the mob's overseer in Las Vegas, making sure that things ran smoothly. He actually was involved in the Tropicana gift shop for a while as his base of operations. And if you think about it, later on, when Tony Spilatro comes here, what's his original base of operations? He has the gift shop at the Circus Circus. So maybe the gift shop is a good place to sit there and keep an eye on things. Now, Rosselli testified before the same Senate committee, often called the Church Committee, about the mob working with the CIA to try to kill Fidel Castro. Okay, so the government and the mob are working together trying to kill Castro, who they were glad to get rid of in the mob, because he had killed the cash cow in Havana. The recruiter who spoke to Roselli for the CIA was Robert Mayhew. Robert Mayhew went on to be the eyes, ears, and face and voice of Howard Hughes in Las Vegas. By the time Roselli testified, there'd been a big falling out. Mayhew had sued Hughes. There was all this fighting that Jeff Schumacher's book talks about. Got to get a plug in for Jeff's book. And you can read that story there. But the fact is, Mayhew was involved with the FBI and the CIA, and reputedly was a go-between on this. Now, I just throw this in because I have fun with it. So what in the world is Ralph Lamb doing here? Ralph Lamb was the sheriff of Las Vegas from 1961 to 78, pre-Metro and then Metro. And I mention it because Lamb had a rule, apparently, that if a mobster visited Las Vegas, his first duty was to report to Lamb that he was here, and then Lamb would leave him alone. And Roselli wouldn't do that. So Lamb went to the DI coffee shop, grabbed Roselli by the necktie, yanked him over the table, dragged him through the casino, threw him in the car, took him downtown, and had him deloused. My theory is, if they'd had any brains and they wanted to get rid of Castro, you don't go to Roselli, you don't go to the mob. Ralph Lamb could have gotten it done. I'm not saying Ralph Lamb would have done it, but I think Ralph was a kind of a can-do guy. So there are love triangles, quadrangles, and other things going on here. There's also a guy who doesn't get much attention. He's on the right, Hy Raskin. Hy Raskin was a labor lawyer in Chicago. He was part of the Democratic machine. He was an old friend of Adlai Stevenson, who'd run his campaigns in the West in 52 and 56, when Stevenson had the great pleasure of getting beaten by Dwight Eisenhower. Raskin also knew Joe Kennedy. In 1958, Raskin came to Nevada on behalf of the Kennedy family. And at the time, Nevada had a three-way Democratic gubernatorial primary between the state attorney general, Harvey Dickerson, attorney George Franklin, who was down here in Las Vegas, and the Elko district attorney who had just become a university regent, Grant Sawyer. Raskin met with the campaigns and concluded that Sawyer was the coming man. And he picked correctly. Sawyer won the Democratic primary, won the general election, and became governor. He had support from the Kennedys. They didn't finance his campaign by any means, but they sent some money and they helped him out a little. Well, Sawyer appreciated Kennedy and was loyal and would go on to support him at the 1960 convention, and Kennedy, presumably from the photo, appreciated Sawyer. Now, that was one Kennedy who appreciated Sawyer. We'll get to the other Kennedy who didn't feel so good about Sawyer later on. In addition, Raskin did an oral interview or oral history later where he said that he asked Jack Kennedy, "Why did you put Lyndon Johnson on the ticket?" And Kennedy told him, "Because he and Sam Rayburn blackmailed me." Now, did they? They may have. Was it that Kennedy sensed Raskin did not like the idea of LBJ as his running mate and decided to tell him a story? It would not be the first time a politician took a little wide turn around the truth. It also would not be the first time a politician was totally honest. So whatever else happened, Raskin had no more to say. But he's involved in this whole thing, and there are rumors of his connections because he's involved in Chicago politics. Yeah, I should have done a flow chart. It would have been so much easier. I could have sent you the flow chart and we could have done it. So it gets even more complicated. So again, the story was that Sinatra was the front man for Giancana's interest at the Cal Neva. Was he? Well, whether or not he was, in 1960, Governor Sawyer's gaming agents created a new document, a list of people who could not enter Nevada's casinos. They called it the Black Book. And they called it the Black Book because it was in a black binder. So it's a good thing they didn't have a red binder or a blue binder, or it'd be the red book or the blue book. Well, it's the Black Book. And Sam Giancana was one of the first 11 people in it. We have some friends in Southern California who knew one of the 11. I think he was the last living one, Louis Dragna. And he would go to the country club where they were, and he'd sit there, and he was a charming old man. Then they'd say, Mr. Dragna, what did you do for a living? And he would say, huh? What? I didn't hear that. Okay. Well, Giancana, being in the Black Book, could not set foot in a Nevada casino. Sinatra hosted him at the Cal Neva in the summer of 1963. And under Nevada's laws, that meant he could lose his license. Well, as it turned out, the story broke, it got into the press, and the chair of the Gaming Control Board, Ed Olson, got a call from Sinatra. And Sinatra wondered why they're picking on him, and Olson said, we're not, Mr. Sinatra, it's just these are the rules. These are the rules you have to follow. He said, well, I have friends. You can't tell me who to hang out with. And Olson, well, actually, I can. That's part of my job, and there are certain friends you can't hang out with. And we're going to have to figure out how to work this out. And Sinatra then said, and I'll try not to violate MLB's codes on what players can do, don't with me, Ed. And Olson said, what? And Sinatra said, don't with me, Ed, or you're going to get a big fat-ing surprise. And I think you know what the word is. And Olson was kind of shocked. And later, Sinatra's lawyer called, and oh boy, it was not a good thing, and Sinatra had to give up his license. Now, by this time, there seemed to have been a falling out, partly because Kennedy was going to visit Southern California in 1962 and stay at Sinatra's estate in Palm Springs. Sinatra had even built a helipad for the presidential helicopter, and then Sinatra got mad at somebody, said or did something, and Kennedy didn't feel he should be near him, and instead stayed with Bing Crosby. So if you can't have one crooner, you can have another. And Sinatra apparently resented this. I've also thought it was kind of interesting that later when they did Robin and the Seven Hoods, Crosby and Sinatra were in the movie. Anyhow, in September of 1963, Kennedy came to Las Vegas to speak at the convention center for the re-election campaign that sadly was never meant to be. And he was greeted at the airport by the governor and joined by the state's 2 U.S. senators, Alan Bible and Howard Cannon. And when Kennedy saw Sawyer, he said to him, what are you doing to my friend Frank Sinatra? And Sawyer said, Mr. President, you take care of the country and I'll worry about Frank Sinatra. Well, in any case, it didn't help Sinatra, and he did lose his license. So, there was a conspiracy to kill John Kennedy, and all of us in this room were part of it. Any questions? I swear everybody in the world was part of this. Well, there are some odd connections. All right, Lee Harvey Oswald was friendly with some family members. An uncle named Charles Dutz Murrett in New Orleans, who was tied to the New Orleans mob, and that's Oswald with Murrett's wife and daughter. Now, Murrett was tied to Sam Saya, who worked for Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans mob boss. Now, we know that Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Why? Because it was on live television, because the Dallas Police Department did not exactly do the due diligence on security that we wish they had. And we have that famous photo, and it was actually live on NBC at the time. Jack Ruby was tied to the Dallas rackets, including 2 Dallas bosses, Joey Savello and Joe Campisi. So was it the Dallas mob involved? Was it the New Orleans mob? Was Jack Ruby taking care of business for the mob? Who knows? But if you think Dallas wasn't in the big leagues, when we talk about the mob and we talk about organized crime, we don't tend to think of Dallas. Well, let me introduce you to an old friend of ours who came to Las Vegas in 1946, and he was asked, why did you leave Dallas? And he said, my sheriff got beat. Well, that was none other than Benny Binion. Now, I'm not saying Binion had any connection. I would never say that. What I am saying is Dallas was the big leagues. Was Ruby indeed a hitman for these purposes. I once came up with the wacky theory that Ruby thought Oswald was a mob hitman, and he wasn't. But Ruby thought he was and thought he'd better silence him. Will we ever know? Probably not. Besides, it's more fun to talk about the conspiracies, right? Well, the assassination had other strange connections. Bobby Kennedy had targeted the mob, and we'll be talking about him and those connections in a couple of minutes. But there is the story that he was haunted by the thought that he had somehow triggered this with his pursuit of organized crime. By then, Joseph Kennedy had suffered a debilitating stroke. He could not speak well, and whatever he might have known or thought, we really can't say. When the Senate investigated under Frank Church, the committee counsel was Robert Blakey, and this spot where he's standing may look a little familiar because it's in the Mob Museum. And he is interviewed in videos, and has he spoken here? I think he spoke here. And he was the committee counsel and concluded that organized crime may well have been involved. Blakey's the guy who wrote the RICO statute, so he knew something about organized crime. And he thought it went back to the Castro connection. In addition, Marcello had his involvement, and Jimmy Hoffa reputedly wanted to be rid of the Kennedys. Well, he certainly wanted to be rid of Bobby. Did he actually have anything to do with getting rid of John Kennedy? As I say, everybody in America was part of the conspiracy. So with that in mind, there's Bobby Kennedy and his connections or involvement with organized crime. Bobby Kennedy made his first big national splash as the counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management. Now, Estes Kefauver, whose committee came to this courtroom, the Senate Committee to Invest Organized Crime, etc., but it became known as the Kefauver Committee. This committee became known as the McClellan Committee for its chair, John McClellan, who's in the photo with the Kennedys in this case. McClellan was from Arkansas, spent 34 years in the Senate, had been Adlai Stevenson's running mate in '52, and he continued the investigations after Bobby Kennedy left for a different gig, specifically to be Attorney General. At the time, his brother said, "We want Bobby to get some experience before we let him go out to practice law." Well, the committee investigated everything from the Chicago jukebox business, which apparently had some illegal activities going on, to a group at the bottom, Johnny Dio, short for Johnny DioGuardi, who helped set up the fake locals that got Jimmy Hoffa elected head of the Teamsters Union. He also was known for throwing acid in the face of the labor columnist Victor Reisel, blinding him. They questioned the Gallows from the Colombo crime family, who may have helped kill Albert Anastasia. Joe Profaci, who may have been involved in the murder, and if they watch the live stream or they watch it in the archives, my wife's family lives in the Portland, Oregon area. They investigated rackets in Portland, Oregon. Yes, Portland. It's hard to believe, Portland. But they investigated a little bit everywhere. And the interesting thing is, one of the reasons for this committee was that McClellan did not trust the Senate Labor Committee to do a proper investigation because he felt the chair of the Labor Committee was too close to labor unions. And the chair of the Senate Labor Committee was John F. Kennedy. Go figure. It's a small, small world. Well, here we're looking at Ahab and the Great White Whale. And believe me, Bobby could have played the Gregory Peck role pretty well. It's safe to say he became obsessed with Jimmy Hoffa. Bobby would not tolerate the Fifth Amendment. He got a lot of flack and grief from civil libertarians who felt that he ran roughshod over witnesses. There were some other Democrats who felt that he was unfair to witnesses. At one point, Hoffa was arrested and accused of trying to bribe a committee aide and was acquitted. So the committee didn't actually get Hoffa. Ultimately, Jimmy Hoffa went to prison for jury tampering, attempted bribery, conspiracy, mail fraud, and wire fraud. But the prosecutors who got him put away reported to an attorney general named Robert Kennedy. So the committee may not have gotten him, Bobby Kennedy kind of did. Eventually, Bobby published a book on the subject, A Crusading Lawyer's Personal Story of a Dramatic Struggle with the Ruthless Enemies of Clean Unions and Honest Management. We have laughter. I wonder. Well, perhaps Bobby was a bit overdramatic. He wasn't, though, limiting himself to Jimmy Hoffa. He targeted organized crime, especially in Las Vegas. Bobby felt that J. Edgar Hoover wasn't sufficiently willing to pursue organized crime cases. There is a clip of Hoover talking about organized crime during the Kefauver hearings and saying that if local law enforcement would enforce what's on the statute books, we'd be rid of all this in 24 hours. There are rumors of all kinds about the mob extorting J. Edgar Hoover. There are all kinds of other stories. Suffice it to say, Hoover had not done a lot by this time, and Bobby Kennedy decided he was going to do something. What he decided to do was reach out to Nevada's Attorney General at the time, Roger D. Foley. Now, down the block is the Foley Federal Building, named for that legal and political family. Roger T. Foley, the father, was a federal judge. His son, Roger D., followed him as a federal judge. The other brothers went on to various judgeships, elected offices, practicing law, and so on. Well, Bobby wanted to deputize the 65 agents to raid Las Vegas casinos to get every bit of evidence they could get. This greatly upset Governor Sawyer. Now, Sawyer was a good Democrat, loyal to Kennedy, supported him, whereas, in fact, Bible and Cannon had been LBJ supporters at the 1960 convention. Sawyer stuck with JFK. When Foley informed Sawyer of this plan, he got on a plane with Foley to go back to D.C. and made an appointment to see the Attorney General. Now, let me quote Grant Sawyer. To my recollection, it was on a weekend because when I was shown in to see Bobby Kennedy, I found him dressed for a game of tennis or something. I asked if he was planning to raid Nevada, and if so, why. We had a heated discussion, to say the least. Well, they did. Sawyer already was being critical of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. He felt that with the FBI, it was all give and no take. The FBI would take information from Nevada, happily supplied by Nevada officials led by Sawyer, but they would not do anything to help Nevada. And Sawyer resented that, and he resented, eventually, when it came out, the wiretapping that Hoover did. In turn, Bobby Kennedy upset him on a few levels. One was he looked at Nevada, as many people then did, as a den of iniquity. He looked at me like I just stepped out from behind some crap table. In addition, he said, Bobby's plan made no political sense. The last time I had seen him before this was in Los Angeles at the 1960 Democratic Convention when he came to my room pleading for the Nevada votes for his brother. I do believe Sawyer is going just a little bit there. Well, dissatisfied with what happened in Bobby Kennedy's office, Sawyer went over the next day to see John Kennedy. He said, as I told him the story and described the devastating effect I thought this raid would have on Nevada, I got the impression that he knew nothing about his brother's plan. The president was very cordial, very nice. He made no commitments, but the raid never occurred. Sawyer suggested there would be a political downside as well. What would the downside be? Maybe costing Kennedy Nevada in 1964. Maybe things would come out. Who knows? We do know the raid never happened. We do know that Kennedy and Hoover both illegally wiretapped various casino owners. There is a story, and I've am not convinced of it, but I'm willing to believe it, that the agents listening on the wiretap one time heard a casino operator on the phone reading a memo from J. Edgar Hoover that they hadn't gotten yet. I do believe in journalism they say that's having sources. Well, whatever happened, Sawyer said, I felt personally betrayed because I had given my support to the president and tried to convince everybody in Nevada that he was a great guy and that he would be sensitive to our problems and all that. Then to have his administration turn on us almost immediately after the election was a bit of political treachery. And I was concerned that the planned action would be damaging to our congressional delegation. Even after my meeting with President Kennedy, although the raid was canceled, the general situation in Nevada improved very little. In 1963, Carl Cohen, a 10% shareholder in the Sands, found microphones in his office, and I believe in his house, and other top-ranking casino executives in this state were wiretapped. This was disgraceful. If you have a federal law, you should abide by it everywhere, not just everywhere but Nevada. To bring the story full circle, Carl Cohen at the Sands eventually had a well-known fight with Frank Sinatra. Sinatra's credit line had been cut off after Howard Hughes bought the Sands, and when he came in to talk to Cohen about it in the coffee shop, whatever he said, he hit the right combination, and Cohen decked him. After which Sinatra collected the caps from his teeth and went across the street to perform thereafter at Caesar's Palace and never went back to the Sands. So when we come to the end of this, Grant Sawyer said in 1968 if Bobby Kennedy had been the nominee, he didn't see how he could have voted for him. And of course, Bobby Kennedy did not get to be the nominee. He was assassinated, and rumors have persisted since that Sirhan Sirhan was not acting on his own or acting for the reasons he claimed, just as we don't know for sure about Lee Harvey Oswald. We do know that the Kennedys were close to the mob in certain ways, close in terms of some friendships, close in terms of some affairs, close in terms of fighting them. And there is a description of John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy that John Kennedy in Boston was the first Irish Brahmin, meaning the elite of Boston, and Bobby Kennedy was the first Irish Puritan. Well, I don't know about all that. Here's what I do know. There are still papers that have not been opened. There are still people around who may know something and aren't talking, and there are a lot of people who are no longer around who weren't talking. So are we ever going to know if we can untangle the web completely? I think we have a better chance of untangling Charlotte's Web. And with that, if you have some questions, I'll be glad to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So if you have questions, what I'd like to do is have an individual come up to the microphone here. We're on a live stream, so we want everybody to be able to hear the questions, so we need to come up to the mic. Nobody likes to be first, but you have to have questions about the Kennedys. Come on up.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My question is concerning the mob's interest in JFK after the Bay of Pigs. There was a lot of talk of him being, of the mob being very angry that it just went as a complete mess, and that he never provided enough support for getting rid of Castro and basically letting the mob come into that, including Carlos Marcello. Mm-hmm. How do you feel that fits into the whole story of how Kennedy could have been involved with the mob, but then he couldn't be as well?
Thank you. And the question was about the Bay of Pigs and the mob being unhappy that it didn't work. And the Bay of Pigs was a disaster on a number of levels. And Kennedy afterward made the comment, and it's not a very nice comment, but it's politically, I think, kind of amusing. He said, "I'm worse than Eisenhower. The more I screw up, the more popular I am." And he did apparently have a bit of a bump in the polls, as they'd say. The mob was upset about it, no question. They wanted to get back in. They wanted to be rid of Castro. Now, that doesn't mean that they wanted to be rid of Castro for the same reasons that the Kennedys did, of course, but if your interests sort of swim into the same stream, then fine. I think they were upset with Kennedy. I think that if they gotten rid of Castro and they'd been happy in Havana, does that mean that Kennedy would not have been killed? And that goes back to the whole question of whether they actually were involved. So for all we know, it might have been anyway. But I think there's no question the mob was disappointed it didn't work out.
We have another question. There you go. Come on up.
My question's a little bit different. Going back to the gubernatorial race, I am related to George Franklin, and I would just like to know, had he been backed instead of Sawyer, how differently my life had turned out.
And George Franklin is one of my all-time favorite characters in our history. I don't think he actually went to law school. He got his diploma through some sort of correspondence or something. I mean, he worked his way up. And he was a successful attorney, county commissioner, I believe, district attorney. And he ran in '58, and Franklin was a Democrat, and had he been elected governor, he ultimately would have supported Kennedy for the election. Whether he would have supported him in the primaries, or I should say the convention, is another matter. I do not know that Franklin was as, and I'm not going to put it in quotation marks, as liberal as Grant Sawyer. So there might have been different approaches to some issues. He probably would have been very much for gaming regulation. Sawyer got a lot of grief from certain parties for his support for civil rights. Would Franklin possibly have navigated that better or been as supportive? I don't know. And we really can't know. I am going to tell you, though, a favorite story of mine that doesn't have a lot to do with this, but I get a kick out of it. Hank Greenspun could not stand George Franklin. Now, that was okay because George Franklin couldn't stand Hank Greenspun, so the feeling was mutual. And the Sun did a story attacking Franklin. And I believe it had to do with adoptions. And attorneys then would often do adoptions kind of under the table. People didn't necessarily want it known. And they did a story that really attacked Franklin, and he sued Greenspun for libel. He won the case, and Greenspun decided to appeal it. Now, Hank Greenspun had something to do with this room, because there was a lawsuit he filed against McCarran and the casino owners for a conspiracy to try to drive the Sun out of business. He was later indicted for inciting assassination when he wrote a column about Senator Joseph McCarthy. So he has a connection to this room. This did not happen in this room. It was at the state level. And when Greenspun decided to appeal, his insurance company said, "No, you've lost. We'll pay the $75,000 or whatever it is that you owe." And all right. Greenspun said, "No, I'm appealing. And under the policy, you have to pay me if you're not going to represent me and indemnify me." So they paid Greenspun, I think, $75,000 to get out of the policy because they figured they'd lose bigger. It got to the Supreme Court of Nevada, and they threw out the libel suit on a technicality. It had to be 25 years later. Eugene Moring, who did the best scholarly history of Las Vegas, resort city in the Sun Belt, and was one of my professors, he called Franklin for background on something, and I had done a paper that was later an article that mentioned this incident. And he thought, I got to ask. And he said, 30 years later, Franklin was yelling, "He libeled me and made $75,000. So at least George Franklin contributed to the Hank Greenspun retirement fund or something. But he might have been a fine governor. He was certainly an operator. So it would have been interesting to see him in action.
Mike, you mentioned, somebody you mentioned during your talk has a real strong connection to this room. Do you want to talk about that?
Which?
Foley?
So, when I mentioned the Foley family, the Foley Federal Building was originally just the Federal Building, and it opened in 1968 on Las Vegas Boulevard South. Las Vegas Boulevard South. Yes, it's past Fremont, so it's south. Good, okay. I can get lost in my bedroom, so don't. Well, Roger T. Foley and Roger D. Foley, as federal judges, heard cases in this room. Roger T. heard the lawsuit Greenspun filed against McCarran, and who had been the senior U.S. senator who got to choose who the federal judge would be, and it was Roger Foley. Aha, yeah, Pat McCarran. And Roger T. Foley ruled according to the law, not according to who he owed. And my wife, Deborah, is sitting at home watching this, cringing at me, I'm sure. And we met in part through the efforts of a woman named Mary Lou Foley, who was Roger D.'s daughter. And when Mary Lou was a little girl, on Saturdays, Roger D. would come and he'd work on the top floor. His office was up there, and he'd look out the window. She was in the park down below playing when she was a little girl. So this is an important room for a lot of reasons.
And another tangled web.
Many tangled webs.
Another question. Anybody else? Come on up.
Well, we know that there were a lot of people involved with the mob, a lot. And let me tell you, I did not expect Sinatra to be in this. And there were people like him and JFK, like a lot of famous people. So what I wonder is, how did so many people get caught up in this? How did so many people get stuck in the mob when they weren't really known for that?
If I told you, I'd have to kill you. No, the question is, how did so many people, famous people get caught up in the mob? And it depends on your definition of being caught up in the mob. So there is a casino here called the Silver Nugget. And it was owned by Major Riddle, who got Teamsters loans and knew Hoffa. And the guy who ran the casino was a Chicago operator named Obie Oberlander. And there was a family here. The grandparents would go play the slots. Their daughter and son-in-law would bring the 3 or 4-year-old grandson along, and Obie would bounce the kid on his knee and then comp them for the 99-cent chicken dinner. Me. I was the kid. There are people who, by that definition, say I'm a mobster because I ate at the mob's table. Well, if you had organized crime figures or people reputed to be organized crime figures who owned nightclubs, who owned bars where there were performers, then entertainers were going to encounter mobsters. You're just not going to avoid it. So very often, you can say, well, was so-and-so connected to the mob? Well, he performed at the club owned by so-and-so, and therefore, and you can make all these connections. Does it mean they were themselves mobsters? I think that's a stretch. Now, Frank, was he connected? I don't know. Was he the front man for Giancana? I don't know. There are rumors to that effect. There's evidence suggesting he was. There are people who were big fans of Frank Sinatra on various levels who'd say, no, we can prove otherwise. There is a story that Dean Martin owned a point in the Sands. And allegedly, one night in the Copa room, and I'll give it my best Dean, he said, do you all know I own a point in the Sands? That means I own 10% of 4 mobsters. Did he? Don't know. But a lot of us have supped at their table, and you couldn't necessarily avoid them. And I was chuckling to myself about the name Diagardi. My late father was a dealer at the Stardust Hotel. Frank Rosenthal personally fired him. My dad's gone now, but he did have an alibi for the night the car blew up. The alibi was my mother, and she's gone too. So, But there was a guy out here named Phil Diagardi, who was the shift boss my dad reported to at the Stardust. Was he actually a mobster or connected to the mob? Well, he worked for casinos owned by mobsters. Does that make him one? Not necessarily. In his later years, Phil Diagardi was a host at the Stardust. And Harry Carey would mention him on Cubs games, hosting a group from Chicago at the Stardust Hotel. Does that mean that the Stardust was still mob connected? No. By then, we know the Stardust was not mob connected. There were still old timers around here. So for long-time Las Vegans like me and some of you here, no matter what we say or do, we're going to be connected. So every now and then, you know, I was once at a movie with a woman I was dating, and it was not going well. And it was The Godfather. It was a film forum. And she'd never seen it. And she wanted to see it, and she wanted me to do the simultaneous translation or whatever. And when Mo Green came on the screen, she went, jabbed me in the ribs. And I leaned over, and I was mad at her by then, mind you. And I said, "Don't make fun of Uncle Mo." And she spent the rest of the movie looking at me like this. I think that's kind of how we look at the whole thing.
I think we had another person who had a question back here. Come on up.
Well, by the time I finished answering a question, nobody wants it. Professors are this way. We won't stop.
Thank you. We got you in a courthouse here, so if we had you up on the stand and you had to give your best professional opinion of who shot JFK. Okay. Your best of your knowledge, your best guess, your best guesstimate, no wiggle room here.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Okay.
Your lie detector tests, everything. Your best professional opinion. Well, who would it be? All right.
Oliver Stone, so he could make the movie. I will go with Lee Harvey Oswald. I think he shot Kennedy. Do we know what motivated him? Do we know who else might have been involved? No. I buy it completely that he shot Kennedy. And there are a couple of things involved here. One is, I remember this, and I think you can get it on YouTube or something. CBS did a documentary in the late 60s where they retraced the Warren Commission's steps. And I remember this. They got a marksman with Oswald's record. In other words, they said, can you get us a guy who had the same numbers as Oswald? And they set up a cart with a cutout on it, put the guy on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, and said, 3 shots in 6 seconds. He did it exactly the same. I can see Oswald having done it. Again, who's behind it? That's another story. And there's a line one of my old professors had, Ralph Roski, who taught history at UNLV for many years. And he said, you realize when James Garfield was shot, the guy who shot him yelled, "I am a stalwart," which was the branch of the Republican Party Garfield was fighting, and Arthur is president now. And Chester Arthur was vice president, became president, and nobody said, do you think Chester Arthur was behind this? And Roski said, we care about Lincoln and Kennedy. We don't think as much about Garfield and McKinley. What was going on with that? And so the conspiracies are appealing. But again, if the question is who was behind it, I'm prepared to go for the mob.
So I would say, I was going to say something a little bit different. You didn't ask me, but
But he should give his opinion anyway. So go for it.
I think if you read deeply into this, if there's something bigger than Lee Harvey Oswald doing his own thing, it's a connection to Cuba, to pro-Cuba people, as opposed to the mob. But
Well,
there's some interaction there too.
yeah, I mean, the mob could have been connected to that. So,
All right, I think we might have had one more. Here we go. Come on up, sir.
you're all out of the house. You might as well enjoy it.
Hey, first of all, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really, you have an extraordinary background in this history.
Well, I
But the
appreciate
one
it. Thank
name,
you.
the one name that I really haven't heard in all of this is a guy named Howard Hughes. And I'm having a hard time, I'm not from Las Vegas, but I'm having a hard time understanding how, while all this was going on, he was snapping up half the land out here, building an empire.
Jeff Schumacher. And seriously, Jeff has done a book on Hughes that is well worth reading. And I was the editor on the book. It was great when it got to me, and I probably damaged it. But it's a great book. Now, Hughes first came out here around 1944 or so, I'm going to say, in the 40s. And he came out to be a tourist, see shows. And he bought land up in Elko. And he eventually did a land swap. And he got a bunch of acreage northwest of Las Vegas that they called Hughesite. And it sat there until his heirs said, let's get out of the casino business, let's do real estate. And in the 80s, they started developing it, and they named it for his grandmother, Jean Amelia Summerlin. So that's where Hughes's land is involved. He gets into buying casinos starting in 1967. So by the time he's doing that, we've had the JFK's assassination. Bobby is no longer Attorney General. Bobby's old department actually got involved because Hughes bought the Desert Inn, the Sands, the Frontier, the Castaway, the Silver Slipper, and he bought the Landmark as it was under construction and finished it. They were going to try to buy the Stardust, and the Justice Department said, no, now we're getting into antitrust. You're buying everything. So were Bobby's people part of that? It could have been. The odd thing is, Robert Mayhew, who was Hughes's number two, in a sense, for Las Vegas, and for everything else at the time, he later made the argument, you know, if we'd gotten the Stardust, think of how we would have cleared out the mob. I'm not convinced Hughes cleared out the mob by any means, even at the hotels he owned, because there were still a lot of the same people in the counting room. But if you think of the Justice Department and Bobby Kennedy's people still being around, you might say, well, they say, oh, here's a chance to get rid of some mobsters. You know, we'd rather have Hughes than the mob. Hughes actually has a connection to Richard Nixon in terms of lending money to Nixon's brother Donald, and whether Hughes was then connected in some way to the '72 election. And Jeff and I were talking about this before we started. Hank Greenspun had a safe with memos from Hughes that was blown up in the summer of '72, and it came up in the Watergate hearings in connection with Watergate itself. There was a Las Vegas tie to Watergate. And you think of Nixon in 1960, and he's running against Kennedy, and of course one of the great bits of trivia is he's in Dallas when Kennedy's killed. I'm not saying Nixon did it. Though if the conspiracy involved everybody. So Hughes has these connections in various places, but he's really on the periphery for this. In the '68 election, he gave money to both Humphrey and Nixon, and of course Bobby Kennedy had been running for president, was assassinated, and Hubert Humphrey goes on to be the nominee. Whether Bobby would have been, who knows? Whether Bobby would have gotten Hughes money, who knows? I don't think Kennedy needed Hughes money. I think he was okay on his own.
Couple quick things. Howard Hughes crossed paths with Joseph Kennedy a number of times early in his life in Hollywood when Joseph Kennedy was toying with the movie business at the same time that Hughes was. So they had a little bit of a connection there. The other comment I would make is that as a movie buff, I'm kind of glad Hughes never bought the Stardust, because then we'd never have had the movie Casino. It would have not have occurred. So.
Yeah. And mind you, the 25th anniversary of Casino is upon us.
25th anniversary in November.
Yeah.
We could take one more if somebody has a question, otherwise we'll wrap it up.
Somebody's waving.
Come on in.
Hello, I had a question about Marilyn Monroe. Was she killed because of her knowledge of Sam Giancana or the Kennedys, or a little bit of both, or was it just because there's rumors of her getting drugs in a way other than orally? And was she murdered, or did she just overdose? Your opinion.
So the view on Marilyn Monroe. And Marilyn Monroe apparently supposedly had affairs with both Jack and Bobby. and some connection to the mob, and we know she had a difficult life. You'll say, oh, beautiful Hollywood star has a difficult life. Yes, she did. And it is possible she was killed. It is possible she just overdosed. It's possible she had a bunch of issues and just screwed up. I don't know. I would not be surprised, but there is a line George Will had when Oliver Stone's movie came out that has kind of guided me in terms of the conspiracy theories. And his comment was, anyone who knows anything about Washington knows that nobody could keep a secret like this. This is too big a secret to be able to keep. Marilyn Monroe could be a secret to keep, but I'll tell you a strange little bit of trivia that shows up in a great article that was in, I think, Esquire. Gay Talese, I think I'm saying it correctly, did on Joe DiMaggio. And there's the famous story, they were married, not Talese and DiMaggio, Monroe and DiMaggio, and that there was a divorce, there was talk of them getting back together when she died, and he had the flowers sent to her grave. So I believe it was a day honoring Mickey Mantle at Yankee Stadium, and Joe DiMaggio came to speak and honor Mantle. And they've got everybody lined up on the field. And this is in 1965, and the senior Yankees announcer at the time, Red Barber, was emceeing it. And who comes to the game to help honor Mickey Mantle? The newest U.S. Senator from New York, Robert Kennedy. And he goes down the line shaking hands with people. And when he got to DiMaggio, DiMaggio turned kind of like this and coughed, and Kennedy just kept going. And DiMaggio never forgave the Kennedys for what he saw as their mistreatment of Marilyn Monroe. So that gives me a little pause and cause to wonder about some things. And by the way, that was a Bobby Kennedy joke that the satirist Tom Lehrer told when he was elected senator from New York. Lehrer lived in Massachusetts, and he said that we feel we have a certain right to brag because Massachusetts is the only state with 3 U.S. senators. I had to get a Bobby joke in there.
All right, with that, well, please join me in thanking Michael Green.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming to one of my favorite places on earth.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. We'll see you next month for David Schwartz, and we have more to come after that.